Are we recording in 60 frames? You know, I almost didn't even download this demo because I wanted to go into the game with like fresh eyes and just dive into the full experience, but I'm actually really glad that I spent the time playing this because not only is it alleviating all the fears that I had regarding what it might have been, but it kind of showed me that this is a lot of stuff I didn't know I wanted that is playable. And it's great. Changes that I thought I was going to be resistant to are actually really nice. I don't know, something snapped to me and I was like, you know what? I want to play the demo and talk to you guys about my thoughts on it and how it makes me feel. That probably could have been worded a little better. Seriously though, Final Fantasy VII had a huge impact on me when I was growing up. It's not actually my favorite Final Fantasy, but it is the first one I played and introduced me to the franchise and was probably one of the biggest games that really catalyzed me into being into the RPG genre, which is definitely what I play the most of. It's especially crazy to me because it basically became a meme for a time that, you know, Square was never going to actually remake Final Fantasy VII no matter how much people ask, and now that it's actually here in a playable form for people in the demo, it's kind of crazy. Even with how long we've known this is actually in development and happening, the fact that it's now something I can interact with is just crazy to me. So the demo is the very opening section of the game. I'm not gonna go too in depth on everything that happens in it, but basically it's the first roughly 45 minutes. It can take maybe a little longer or a little faster depending on how you play or what you do, but that's about the runtime of it. And it's a really interesting showcase of not only how it differs from the original, but how much it has in common at the same time. There was a lot of work and effort clearly put into making sure that a lot of the same visual set pieces and just general flow of the game remains the same. A lot of the details and specifics are different, not just because the combat's different, but the entire camera work and everything is just a whole new level. But if you look at the level design of the original FF7 and line it up with where you walk and what you do in the remake, it lines up really, really well with a few exceptions. And that's really one of the first things that I really noticed about the game was just the attention to detail in terms of how they remade the maps and locations, but also just really little things. Like, for instance, if you didn't play the original FF7, one of the big mechanics of the game is materia. It's this thing that you equip to your weapons and armor and it lets you do things like cast spells or do special attacks, whatever. And when you start playing the demo, even though you don't have access to the actual options to change these things yet, you'll notice that on Cloud's sword is this little circular slot, and there's a green little jewel on it, and that's what's letting you cast the fire spell during the game. So it stands to reason that, you know, as you attach new abilities or you do more upgrades along lines like how it worked in the original game, you actually get that visual representation on the weapon you're using, and that was the coolest little minor thing I noticed right away. Now, of course, though, the really big obvious thing about this game, aside from the graphical changes, is the combat system. This is something that a lot of people were a little worried about at first, myself included, because there's something very classic about that turn-based approach that the older games had, and Final Fantasy 15, while moving towards that full action style that was very heavily based on Kingdom Hearts, not exactly my favorite game. I liked Final Fantasy 15, but the combat had its issues, and that's something that I think Square clearly took to heart, because a lot of those same bones are clearly in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, but a lot of it has been adjusted and changed in ways that actually I really love. There are two different main ways you can play the game: classic mode and then the actual action mode the game is designed for. Now if you do classic mode, the game handholds you a little bit and automatically handles certain things like auto-attacking enemies, auto-defending against attacks, and focuses more on treating it like an RPG where you're just selecting special commands when it's necessary, like, oh, I want to cast fire right now, or I need to use this item. However, the game's easy and normal modes are more focused on the action-style gameplay and has a lot more in common with 15, and really even more so Kingdom Hearts, where you use an attack button to make different attacks, and then you're able to make use of a special gauge, which is still called the ATB, funny enough, but you're using that to do special commands, like whether you need to cast certain spells or whatever, just whenever you need to do something outside of hitting things. Every time you bring up this menu, it actually slows down the action of the game. It's not a perfect pause, but it is very, very slow, giving the ability to take the time to think about what exactly it is you want to do, and it's integrated into the combat really, really well. What I'm really happiest about, though, as far as the combat goes, is the way the game is integrating the use of your full party. One of the things that I really didn't care about with Final Fantasy 15 was the heavy focus on just having the lead character do stuff. Later DLC gave you the ability to play as the other characters, but was very much a tacked on mechanic and didn't necessarily always feel like a real core part of the combat system, whereas in this, that is clearly something they focused on and spent time with. One of the main ways the demo highlights it is that at first you play just as Cloud, and then eventually you get the ability to also use Barret. And the big thing about Barret, gameplay-wise, is that he has a ranged attack instead of being a melee character. Because of this, there are certain enemies that you basically have to rely on Barret to take down. If there's sentries that are high up, enemies that are in further away locations, you need to make use of his attacks to actually hit them. So the game encourages you to not just simply play as your favorite character, but swap in and out depending on what the situation actually calls for. And there are ways for other characters to still hit things. Cloud can use magic and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, it's just way more efficient to make use of Barret for those situations. And something I really appreciate about this was the fact that the two characters felt distinctly different. It wasn't just a skin or going to a different character that just, ultimately plays the same. They have their own unique special ability that you can use with triangle. They have their own basic attack that works differently. I don't know how well this will hold true for the whole cast of characters, because obviously there are additional people that also use guns. There are other characters that also use melee weapons. But at least for these initial two with Cloud and Barret, it felt like two different versions of the same combat system, which was really rewarding every time I switched between them.
Say that again!
To me, this is everything that I've wanted out of a real-time Final Fantasy. I've always loved the old RPG mechanics, but I knew that a more action-focused gameplay like this was just eventually going to happen. But this is the first one where it really feels right to me. There were things they tried to do with 12 and 15 and others that was okay and I didn't necessarily hate, but it never felt like a perfect fit. And this is the first one really does feel like it's combining the concepts of real-time action, but all the mechanics I loved in the older games. Where this really stood out to me was in the demo's final boss fight. I don't want to go fully in depth on it, but it is a remix on what happens in the original version of the game. It doesn't follow the exact same mechanics for obvious reasons, but they managed to make it something that's a little different and really capitalizes on the game's combat system. And the fact that you're constantly switching between characters and adjusting your tactics and, really trying to read what it is the enemy's doing and kind of solve the puzzle along with still having that action gameplay was really well done. Now, while the combat is, of course, the main thing that I think this demo really imparts on players because you don't have access to the full menu system, obviously you're only getting a snippet of the plot line. Something else that I think is really important is that it does kind of set the tone for the overall game and lets you know that, hey, while this is based on the events that happen in FF7, things are a little bit different. I mean, if you line up and play both the original game and this demo back to back, there are a lot of minute but kind of important changes. A lot of different narrative beats are changed, there are specific scenes that play out slightly differently, and as a result, it really makes me wonder what the full version of the remake is going to be like, because obviously it's only doing a small opening segment of the game, but expanding it out to something much larger. For instance, playing through this same segment in the original FF7 is about 20 minutes. The demo, on the other hand, like I said, took about 45. Obviously, there is a lot left of this game that we need to learn once it actually fully releases, but this demo is a great sample and honestly leaves pretty much every fear I had. Not that I thought that the remake was going to be bad or was doomed, but look, just based on the track record of some other recent Final Fantasy games, and there's always that just fear of what happens when people take something that was great before and try to do it again and just loses it all, this has put a lot of those fears aside for me. Between the redone visuals, the combat system, and the music, I haven't even talked about the music, where it's just all these amazing remixes of the original compositions that fits this redone style so well. It just all comes together and feels like a proper new game. If there wasn't an original title to hold on to and compare it to, this would still stand on its own as an excellent game so far, which I think is really important because there's so many times where you have titles that are relying heavily on the nostalgia or just trying to be like, hey, remember what was cool about this game? Huh? Isn't that great? This doesn't feel like it's overly relying on that. Obviously it is to an extent because it's a remake, but it still feels like something fresh on its own. Very much why I liked the Resident Evil 2 remake that Capcom did. I'm getting that same kind of vibe here, and that is a very, very good thing. More than anything, I think the biggest takeaway for me here is I am so glad I decided not to cancel my collector's edition of the game, because that fear was real for a little bit. They made Jesse a lot thirstier for Cloud. That was a little weird.
So, you know Tifa, right? It's not really my business, but are you guys close?